Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States from 1861 to 1865, is one of the most significant figures in American and world history. Renowned for his leadership during the American Civil War, his role in abolishing slavery, and his eloquence in speeches such as the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln's life is a case study in resilience, moral clarity, and political mastery. So, to kick things off, let's start off with his early life and his background from 1809 to 1830. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a one room log cabin situated on the Sinking Spring Farm in Hardin County, Kentucky, which is now known as LaRue County. The land was part of the rugged and often lawless American frontier at the time, an area marked by its dense forests, uncertain land titles, and scattered settlements. The cabin into which Lincoln was born measured just 16 by 18 feet, made of rough hewn logs with a dirt floor and a crude chimney. So life on the frontier. So it was unforgiving, and from the very start, Lincoln's existence was entwined with struggle, transience, and labor. His parents, Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, were of modest means and limited formal education, yet they were people of integrity and deep conviction. Thomas Lincoln was a farmer and a carpenter, known for his industriousness and honest reputation in the community, but plagued by land title disputes that were common in Kentucky at the time. In fact, one of the reasons for the Lincoln family's eventual migration out of Kentucky was Thomas's repeated legal losses over contested land claims. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, by contrast, she remains somewhat enigmatic in the historical record. Accounts describe her as intelligent, affectionate, and morally upright. Despite her illiteracy, she instilled in her son an appreciation for virtue, for storytelling, and spiritual reflection. Abraham would later speak of her with profound reverence, stating, "All that I am or hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." Her influence would echo in his character long after her early death. Lincoln had an older sister named Sarah, born in 1807, and a younger brother named Thomas Jr., who died in infancy. Thus, Abraham's formative years were shaped not only by hardship, but also by a tight knit family structure that revolved around faith, toil, and survival. By 1816, the Lincoln family, disillusioned by Kentucky's inconsistent property laws and increasingly encroaching slavery system, moved across the Ohio River to southern Indiana, setting in what would become Spencer County. Abraham was only 7 years old at the time. Indiana, newly admitted to the Union as a free state, offered the hope of clear land titles and a fresh start. However, the move was grueling. The Lincolns cleared a tract of densely wooded land and lived in a makeshift three-sided shelter for the first winter, later building a more permanent log cabin. Just 2 years later, in October 1818, tragedy struck the family, so Nancy Hanks Lincoln died at age 34 from milk sickness, a mysterious and deadly disease at the time, caused by consuming milk or meat from cows that had eaten the white snake root plant, which contains the toxic substance known as trematol. Her death devastated the family. She was buried on a knoll near their cabin in what would later be known as the Little Pigeon Creek Cemetery. Abraham, only 9 years old, had to help raise himself and contribute more heavily to the family's survival. This early encounter with death, especially one so inexplicable and rooted in the dangers of rural life, it left a permanent scar on Lincoln, and it sharpened his early sense of human frailty and loss. In December 1819, just over a year after Nancy's death, Thomas Lincoln returned to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and married Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with three children of her own. She was a woman of strong will, warm presence, and practical skill. Importantly, she brought furniture, household items, and even books, commodities sorely lacking in the Lincoln household. But perhaps her greatest contribution was her nurturing relationship with the young Abraham Lincoln. So Sarah Bush Lincoln took a special liking to the boy, later saying that she felt as though he was her own child. She provided him with emotional stability and championed his desire to learn, a trait that had begun to emerge even during his most difficult years. Abraham would later credit her as a key figure in his development, stating she was a good and kind mother. The household now consisted of two blended families under one roof in the wilderness, and though economic hardship persisted, Sarah's presence brought order and emotional support. So this period it marked a subtle but profound shift in Abraham's internal world. While the outside world remained harsh and unpredictable, the domestic sphere became a place of encouragement. Despite growing up in an environment where formal education was sparse and often of poor quality, Lincoln possessed a fierce internal drive to learn. He had less than 12 months of cumulative schooling, attending a series of irregular and primitive frontier schools, often referred to as blab schools, where students would memorize and recite lessons aloud. Teachers were generally underqualified, and the facilities were little more than log huts. But Abraham's education was self directed and voracious. He borrowed books whenever he could, and he read them by firelight at the long days of labor. Among those, the most formative works he encountered were the Bible, Aesop's Fables, The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, Parson Weems' Life of Washington, and later the plays of Shakespeare. These books gave Lincoln access to moral reasoning, classical rhetoric, and models of leadership and perseverance that would shape his intellectual and his political identity. He also practiced writing on wooden shingles, the backs of shovel blades, and scraps of paper when ink and paper were unavailable. His literacy, still rare among the frontier youth, set him apart and became a defining feature of his personal character. Lincoln's stepmother once said he read all the books he could lay his hands on. He would get irritated when there was nothing to read. This commitment to self improvement, forged in the crucible of rural hardship, became a cornerstone of his ethos. Lincoln would later be described as someone who rose from nothing, but this underestimates the conscious discipline and intellectual hunger he cultivated in his formative years. From a very young age, Lincoln was put to work, splitting rails, planting crops, and performing strenuous manual labor to support his family. By the age of 9 or 10, he was already handling an axe, a tool that will that becomes symbolic of his rugged youth. He was hired out to neighbors for day labor, and legally until he turned 21, and his wages belonged to his father. Yet, even while immersed in physical toil, Lincoln exhibited a developing inner life. He was known to make clever remarks, to tell humorous stories, and imitate preachers or politicians with theatrical flair. He could recite entire passages of scripture or Shakespeare from memory and began writing crude poems and essays about life, death, and the human condition. These twin characteristics, the physical resilience and mental agility, it distinguished him from his peers. He was tall, wiry, and strong, but quiet and introspective. He disliked hunting and killing animals, which was rare for a frontier boy, and had a lifelong sensitivity to animal suffering. Friends and family began to notice his melancholy temperament, a trait that would later evolve into his famous reflective stoicism. In the early spring of 1830, when Abraham Lincoln was 21 years old, the family made another move. This time to Macon County, Illinois. The journey involved crossing the Mississippi and moving through dense woods, the rivers, and harsh terrain. The official reason was the lure of more fertile land and better prospects, though the underlying motivation likely included continuing frustrations with Indiana's agricultural limitations and legal infrastructure. Once again, the Lincolns built a log cabin, cleared forested land, and attempted to carve out a livelihood. It was during this time that Abraham Lincoln began asserting greater independence. He was no longer under legal obligation to work for his father, and he began hiring himself out for rail splitting, for ferrying, and flatboat work, beginning the slow pivot from frontier boy to self made man. And also, let's dive into the early career in law practice from 1830 to 1860. So, first thing is to talk about is the political beginnings of Abraham Lincoln. So in 1832, a 23-year-old Abraham Lincoln he made his first foray into public life by running for the Illinois General Assembly, representing the Sangamon County. At this point, Lincoln was still relatively new to Illinois, having moved with his family from Indiana in 1830. His early campaign relied not only on political connections, of which he had few, but on his growing popularity in New Salem as a store clerk and postmaster. He ran as a member of the Whig Party, which had not fully solidified its presence in the region. Lincoln's political platform emphasized economic development, the expansion of infrastructure, particularly the roads and the canals, and education. So these positions reflected the Whig vision of using government to stimulate economic growth, contrasting sharply with the Jacksonian Democrats who emphasize minimal government and agrarian self sufficiency. However, his campaign faltered. So, despite finishing eighth out of 13 candidates, it was an important step because it introduced Lincoln to the political stage and it also planted the seeds of his reputation for honesty and for self discipline. And this same year, Lincoln also served in the Black Hawk War as a militia captain. Although he saw no combat, nevertheless, the leadership position it earned him local recognition and it gave him practical experience in organizing men and maintaining discipline, skills that would later be crucial during the Civil War. And undeterred by his first loss, Lincoln ran again in 1834 and he won a seat in the Illinois House of Representatives. He would go on to serve four consecutive terms from 1834 to 1842. During these years, he aligned closely with the rising Whig establishment in Illinois. He was a staunch supporter of Henry Clay and the American system, a plan that championed internal improvements, a national bank, and protective tariffs to stimulate domestic industry. During his time in the legislature, Lincoln advocated fiercely for infrastructure improvements because he pushed for the development of railroads, roads, and navigable canals that would connect Illinois farmers to markets. A notable success was the Illinois Internal Improvements Act of 1837, which authorized state spending on transportation projects. However, the project ultimately failed due to overreach and the Panic of 1837, resulting in a significant state debt. So the project, though it fell short, Lincoln's support for this project it demonstrated his belief in progress through government intervention, which was also another Whig hallmark. And it's also important to note that while he was morally opposed to slavery from early on, he was not yet an abolitionist at this time because he opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, largely on economic and constitutional grounds, believing it to be a threat to the opportunities of white laborers. So in 1837, he joined fellow Whig Dan Stone in issuing a public protest against slavery in the Illinois General Assembly, the only legislators to do so at that time. The protest read in part that slavery was founded on both injustice and bad policy, but it also affirmed that Congress that they had no power to interfere with slavery in the states. And this reveals the early contours of Lincoln's anti-slavery ideology. Morally repulsed, morally repulsed by this. Morally repulsed by this, by the institution, yet committed to a gradual constitutional path towards its containment. And it's also important we talk about Abraham Lincoln's legal career as well. So in 1836, he was serving. So while serving in legislature, he studied law independently, borrowing books from practicing attorneys like John T. Stuart. So in 1836, after passing an oral examination conducted by a panel of established lawyers, Lincoln was admitted to the Illinois bar. So he began practicing law in Springfield, which would become both his political and his legal base. And also around 1841, all the way to 1860, he had a partnership with William Herndon. So in 1841, he entered in a formal partnership with him, who, William H. Herndon, he was a younger and a more idealistic attorney. So their firm was known as Lincoln and Herndon. So this became one of the most respected in Springfield. Although Herndon, he handled much of the research and the clerical work, Lincoln, he was the face of the practice in court, known for his ability to relate to juries and his meticulous cross examinations and his ethical integrity. So their practice, it covered a wide range of legal issues. So first thing, it was criminal law. So Lincoln, he defended and he prosecuted numerous criminal cases. One of the most famous was the 1858 defense of William Duff Armstrong, whom he got acquitted of murder by discrediting a prosecution witness using an almanac to prove the moon wasn't bright enough for the witness to have seen what he claimed. And then the second is civil litigation. So Lincoln, he handled disputes over debt, over land titles, slander, divorce, and contracts. So his ability to distill complex matters into simple, logical arguments, it also made him a highly sought after litigator. And third, it was his appellate work. So Lincoln, he argued over 400 cases before the Illinois Supreme Court. And finally, it was corporate law, because as the railroads around this time as they expanded, Lincoln increasingly represented corporations, particularly the Illinois Central Railroad, which became one of his major clients. In fact, the company's case involving tax exemptions, which was the Illinois Central Railroad versus the county of McLean, it became one of Lincoln's most profitable and legally significant cases at that time. And we also had the Lewis versus Lewis, 1849, which is a Supreme Court appearance. So in Lewis versus Lewis, it argued before the United States Supreme Court in 1849. So Lincoln appeared as co-counsel in a dispute over land ownership in Kentucky. Though the case did not become landmark in legal doctrine, his presence alone before the highest court in the nation demonstrated his professional rise. And it also highlighted how Lincoln's legal work intersected with the pressing issues of property rights and economic development in a rapidly expanding nation. Oh yes, and also I wanted to also comment on this, but also it was also Lincoln's his legal philosophy. So his legal philosophy was also rooted in the ethics and fairness, because he was known to decline cases that he believed they lacked merit or moral standing. So in one instance, when he was asked to defend a guilty client, he reportedly said that I must stand with anybody that stands right, and part with him when he goes wrong. So he was also recognized for his calm demeanor and his logical precision, because he disarmed opponents not with aggression, but through careful analysis and genuine respect for the court process. So this calm, deliberative style, it would come to define his political debates in the 1850s. So moving on. So next part is the national politics from 1846 to 1849, and also returning in 1854. So 1846, we have the U.S. House of Representatives. So Lincoln's first and only term in national office prior to the presidency, it came when he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1846, representing Illinois' 7th District. He ran as a Whig and was supported by many anti slavery constituents, including evangelicals and small farmers. Notably, his opponent was the fiery Methodist preacher known as Peter Cartwright, who attempted to portray Lincoln as insufficiently religious, an accusation that Lincoln countered with humor and pragmatism. And 1847 to 1849, his service in Congress. So while in Congress, Lincoln, he focused on the national economic policy, the land grants for settlers, and infrastructure in line with Whig orthodoxy. But his most significant political moment, it came when he took a bold stand against the Mexican American War, which had begun in 1846. So Lincoln introduced what became known as the spot resolutions, a series of pointed questions demanding that President James K. Polk identified the exact spots on American soil where American blood had been shed, as Polk had claimed in justifying the war. And Lincoln, he also suspected the war was engineered by Southern Democrats to expand slave territory into Mexico. And this stand, it made Lincoln unpopular in many quarters, especially among the pro-war voters and within the press. He was labeled Spotty Lincoln by political enemies, a derisive nickname that was meant to mock his dissent. Nevertheless, the episode reflected his emerging courage and standing for principle over popularity, a trait that would define his presidency. And also, so being frustrated with the partnership and the limited achievements of a single term and facing backlash for his anti-war stance, Lincoln he chose not to seek re-election in 1848. So instead, what he did was he campaigned for Whig presidential candidate known as Zachary Taylor, and he returned to Springfield in 1849 to resume his law practice full time. So for the next 5 years, Lincoln remained largely silent in public affairs, though he kept a watchful eye on national politics, especially the growing sectional crisis. So he believed that slavery was morally wrong, but he continued to approach it through legal and constitutional channels, advocating restriction, not immediate abolition. So now we're going to go on ahead and we're going to talk about the rise to national prominence from 1854 to 1860. So the first thing is we want to talk about is the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which was a turning point in Lincoln's political resurgence. Now, so this legislation, this act, and its architect. So the Kansas-Nebraska, this act, so it was engineered by Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, a skilled and ambitious Democratic leader who sought to organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to facilitate the construction of transcontinental of the transcon of a transcontinental road, a railroad. But his motivations were not merely infrastructural, because he aimed to placate Southern interests and preserve sectional peace by advocating for popular sovereignty. And the idea, so pretty much it's the idea that settlers in a given territory that they should determine whether slavery would be permitted. And this proposal, so while seemingly democratic, effectively nullified the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had barred slavery north of latitude 36 degrees 30 in Louisiana Purchase territory. So the Missouri Compromise, it had stood as a fragile bulwark against the spread of slavery for over 3 decades. And Douglas's bill, it threw open the possibility of slavery's expansion into previously free territories. So for Abraham Lincoln, then a former one-term congressman who had largely withdrawn from national politics, so the Kansas-Nebraska legislation, the act itself, it was a moral and constitutional abomination because Lincoln he saw it as a radical betrayal of the founding fathers' intentions, a deliberate reversal of progress toward the eventual extinction of slavery. The idea that slavery might now be permitted in lands once considered permanently free struck him as both dangerous and deeply unjust. So, in his speeches delivered throughout Illinois during the fall of 1854, especially his famous Peoria speech on October 16th, Lincoln laid out a detailed, principled opposition to the act. He framed the debate not merely in legal or political terms, but really in terms of natural rights and national destiny. For Lincoln, slavery was not just a political issue, it was a moral evil that contradicted. So a moral evil in his eyes, one that so yeah, really it was in his eyes. So really it was in his eyes, it was one that contradicted the fundamental ideals of liberty upon which the nation was built, saying that no man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent. So Lincoln declared this, echoing the Jeffersonian principles. So it was this sense of moral urgency combined with the rising tide of Northern outrage that propelled Lincoln back into active politics after nearly a decade away from elected office. And also, it's the birth of the Republican Party, and also what was Lincoln's role in this. So As opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act mounted, it triggered a realignment of political forces. So the Whig Party, already fractured over slavery. They disintegrated from its ashes, and from other disaffected groups. You had free soilers, anti-slavery Democrats, and abolitionists, and they all emerged a new political force known as the Republican Party. So in Illinois, Lincoln he played a central role in founding the state's Republican Party. Though he had spent his early political life as a Whig, his beliefs now align more closely with the nascent Republican platform, which opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories, but did not yet call for immediate abolition in the South. So Lincoln he worked tirelessly behind the scenes, forging coalitions and uniting disparate factions who opposed the spread of slavery. So, despite his personal reservations about the radical tone of some abolitionists, he believed the new party had the potential to channel Northern discontent into a coherent political movement. And he also had support for John C. Fremont in 1856. So, in the 1856 presidential election, Lincoln campaigned vigorously for John C. Fremont, who was known as the first Republican nominee for president. So Fremont, a former military officer and explorer, he ran on a platform that boldly opposed the expansion of slavery. And though ultimately he lost to Democrat James Buchanan, the Republican Party's strong showing, carrying 11 of the 16 free states, it proved that it was a national force to be reckoned with. And Lincoln himself was not a candidate in 1856, but his work within Illinois and his increasing visibility as a speaker and a moral leader, it helped position him as a rising star within the party. And you also have the Lincoln Douglas debates in the year of 1858. So by 1858, you had Lincoln's political stature. So his stature it grown significantly because that year he was elected as the Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate seat that was held by Stephen A. Douglas, the very architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the contest that followed became one of the most famous political showdowns in American history, the Lincoln Douglas debates. So the setting in this was that the two candidates they agreed to a series of 7 formal debates held in towns across Illinois from August to October. Now these events they drew massive crowds and intense newspaper coverage. Though the Senate race itself was confined to Illinois, the debates had national implications. Now, each debate, it lasted 3 hours. One candidate would speak for 60 minutes, and then the other would reply for 90 minutes. And then the first would offer a 30-minute rejoinder. So this format, it allowed for extended, unfiltered arguments, a far cry from the modern soundbite era, and it revealed the depth and clarity of each man's political philosophy. So a lot of the core themes that were talked about were like slavery, states' rights, and the nature of democracy. So the primary topic, of course, obviously was slavery. You know, its morality, its expansion, and its place within the American experiment. But right within the context, within that, well, pretty much within that discussion. So really, when it comes to like the discussion, there were fundamental debates about federalism versus local control, the limits of popular sovereignty, the moral versus the legal framework of government, and whether the U.S. could endure divided between free and slave states. And Lincoln, he famously stated and declared in his opening speech, saying that a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently have slave and have free. So this was a bold and dangerous statement, as it seemed to some to foretell civil war. But Lincoln, he was not advocating secession or rebellion. He was warning that the nation would ultimately have to resolve the slavery issue one way or another. Douglas, on the other hand, he defended his doctrine of popular sovereignty, arguing that local settlers had the right to choose whether to permit slavery. He accused Lincoln of trying to create racial equality, a charge designed to alienate while voters in Illinois. So yes. So pretty much he accused him of trying to create racial equality, a charge that was designed to alienate the white voters in Illinois. And Lincoln, while explicitly denying any immediate intention to bring about social or political equality between the black and the white citizens, he insisted that the black Americans they were entitled to the same natural rights as whites, chiefly the right to liberty. So Lincoln, he lost the election. The Illinois state legislature, which selected senators at the time, they reelected Douglas. But Lincoln, his real victory was intellectual and national. The debates were widely reprinted in newspapers and eventually compiled and published in book form, elevating his reputation as a serious thinker and moral leader. So many in the North they began to see him as a principled, articulate alternative to both the Southern slaveholders and the more cautious centrists like Douglas. Well, Lincoln, while he had not adopted the mantle of abolitionism, his stance that slavery must not be allowed to spread, it solidified the ideological core of the Republican Party, and it also set him on a direct path to the presidency. And we also have the election of 1860 and the secession crisis. So first thing to talk about is the political landscape, a fractionation. So the presidential election of 1860 it occurred during one of the most volatile periods in American political history. The 1850s had seen escalating tensions over the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, exasperated by landmark and controversial events such as, once again, the Kansas Nebraska Act of 1854, but another one that was also known as the Dred Scott decision in 1857, and the violent conflict in and the violent conflict in Bleeding, Kansas. So these disputes they tore apart the existing two-party system. The Whig Party had already collapsed, and the Democratic Party, the only remaining national party, was deeply fractured between its northern and its southern factions. And in this vacuum, the Republican Party, founded in 1854, they emerged as a powerful new force with a platform centered on opposing the expansion of slavery into the territories, while carefully avoiding direct interference with slavery in states where it already existed. So Lincoln's path to the Republican nomination. So at the Republican National Convention, which was held in Chicago in May 1860, Abraham Lincoln was not initially the front runner, so that status it belonged to Senator William H. Seward of New York, who was a prominent abolitionist and a former governor. However, he was considered too radical by many moderates and swing state delegates, and his reputation for making bold, uncompromising statements about slavery is what worked against him. And Lincoln, by contrast, he was viewed as more moderate, yet firmly principled. And his debates with Stephen A. Douglas in the 1858 Illinois Senate race, it had brought a lot of national attention. It brought him a lot of national attention. So even though he lost the Senate race, his powerful speeches, particularly the House divided speech, and his ability to articulate a moral opposition to slavery without alienating the border states, it made him a compelling candidate. So behind the scenes, Lincoln's political team, led by David Davis, Leonard Sweat, and Norman Judd, they all worked masterfully to build coalitions among delegates and present Lincoln as the second choice of many factions. So when Seward failed, so when he failed to gain a majority on the first ballot, the support began to shift. So on the third ballot, Lincoln secured the nomination. His team's political strategy, combined with his reputation for honesty, for clarity, and moderate anti-slavery principles, they proved to be decisive. And also you also have the Republican platform. So the 1860 Republican platform, it was a careful balance of ideological opposition to the expansion of slavery while embracing a broader program of economic modernization. So it included the containment of slavery, which basically in this case meaning that no extension of slavery into federal territories, the preservation of the Union on a free labor foundation. And you also had the support for tariffs, which protective tariffs to support American manufacturing and industry, aimed at winning support in the North and the Mid Atlantic states. And you also had the internal improvements. So the federal support for infrastructure projects such as roads, railroads, and river navigation align with the Whig tradition of economic development, and the Homestead Act and the land reform. So support for granting free land to settlers in the West, and also attracting immigrants and farmers. So this platform, so it united disparate groups, which consisted of former Northern Whigs, Free Soilers, anti-slavery Democrats, and moderate abolitionists. So, in contrast to the United Republican Front, the Democratic Party collapsed along sectional lines. Northern Democrats nominated Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. He advocated for popular sovereignty, letting each territory decide the issue of slavery for itself. However, this position it angered both the Northern abolitionists and the Southern fire eaters. And the Southern Democrats, so angered by the party's refusal to adopt a slave code platform, they walked out of the convention and they reconvened to nominate Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, who supported federal protection of slavery in all territories. And there was also a fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, had emerged from the remnants of the Whigs and the Know Nothings. So they nominated John Bell of Tennessee, and they focused narrowly on preserving the Union and avoiding any explicit mention of slavery, essentially a platform of silence on the most pressing issue of the day. So this split in opposition votes, it gave the Republican Party, it gave them a major electoral advantage, especially in the North, where the population was more concentrated and the electoral votes more numerous. So when it comes, so the election results. So Lincoln he actually won. So he won with 1.86 million votes, just under 40% of the popular vote. But he secured a decisive majority in the electoral college, 180 out of 303 votes. So Douglas he won 1.38 million votes, which is 29%. But he only carried Missouri and a portion of New Jersey. And Breckinridge, he garnered over 840,000 votes, which was 18%, sweeping most of the Deep South. And then Bell, he took 593,000 votes, which was 13%, winning Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. So, significantly, Lincoln's name did not appear on the ballot in 10 southern states, yet he still won the presidency. So his election was achieved entirely through the northern and the western electoral votes, a fact that fueled southern outrage and the fears of political irrelevance. And we also have the next part, which is the succession and the formation of the Confederacy. So when it comes to the immediate reaction to Lincoln's election, so for many in the South, especially like in South Carolina and the Deep South, Lincoln's victory without any Southern electoral support, it confirmed their worst fears that the federal government was now firmly in the hands of a party that they viewed as fundamentally hostile to their way of life, and especially to slavery. Even though Lincoln had repeatedly stated that he would not interfere with slavery in existing slave states, the mere principle of halting its expansion was seen as a direct threat. So Southern political leaders they invoked the compact theory of the Constitution, that the Union was a voluntary association of sovereign states, which retained the right to withdraw if the federal government violated its terms. So, South Carolina was one of the states that led the way in this. So, on December 20th, 1860, just 6 weeks after the election, a specially called South Carolina Secession Convention uh, unanimously passed an ordinance of secession, citing the increasing hostility on the part of the non-slave holding states to the institution of slavery. And this action, it was not taken lightly because it reflected decades of sectional tension and a long history of nullification threats from South Carolina, dating back to the tariff crisis of 1832. So, in the wake of South Carolina's lead, you had other deep South states that also followed in rapid succession. So, by February 1st, 1861, there were six more states that had seceded. You had Mississippi on January 9th. You had Florida on January 10th. Alabama January 11th. Georgia January 19th. Louisiana January 26th. And Texas February 1st. So each of these states, they held their own secession conventions, and they issued declarations of causes, many of which explicitly cited slavery as the central grievance. So Mississippi's declaration, for example, it famously began, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." So, with secession gaining momentum, delegates from the seven seceded states met in Montgomery, Alabama. So, in February 1861 and on February 8th, they officially created a new government known as the Confederate States of America. So, the Confederate States of America, they adopted a constitution that was similar to the US Constitution, but with several key differences. And those differences included the explicit protection of slavery as a fundamental right, prohibition on protective tariffs, emphasis on state sovereignty, while still allowing for a strong executive. So Jefferson Davis, who was a former U.S. Senator from Mississippi and a Secretary of War, he was selected as the provisional president, and Alexander H. Stephens of Georgia as vice president. So during this, so during this, during this crisis, President James Buchanan, whose term ended in March 1861, he claimed that he had no constitutional authority to prevent states from seceding, effectively allowing the crisis to fester. Lincoln, still president elect, he refrained from making inflammatory public statements, instead, focusing on assembling his cabinet and preparing for a presidency that would now begin amid national disunion. Lincoln believed that secession was unconstitutional and illegitimate, but also understood the delicate balance of not provoking further secession in the upper South. So upper South that consisted of states like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and others. So he held firm in his belief that the Union must be preserved, but avoided endorsing coercion until all peaceful options were exhausted. So this next part here, we're going to talk about the presidency and the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. So Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as the 16th president of the United States on March 4th, 1861, in a capital on the brink of civil war. So by the time that he took office, seven southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, they had already seceded from the Union following his election in November 1860. So Lincoln, he had not yet set foot in office yet, and yet his presidency was already engulfed by crisis. So in his first inaugural address, Lincoln he sought to thread a delicate needle. He firmly rejected the legality of secession, stating that the Union was perpetual and that no state could unilaterally leave it. However, he also extended an olive branch to the South. He reassured slaveholding states that he had no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. So this was a calculated political move here. So Lincoln, ever the pragmatist, he understood that maintaining the loyalty of the border states, especially Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, it was essential, because if they joined the Confederacy, the Union might be lost. So, nonetheless, Lincoln's firmness in refusing to recognize secession and his commitment to preserve the Union at all costs armed con it made armed conflict increasingly inevitable. And the spark that ignited the Civil War, so it came barely a month into Lincoln's presidency. So enter Fort Sumter, which was a Fort Sumter was a Union fort that was located in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. So it was running out of supplies. So on April 6, 1861, Lincoln informed the governor of South Carolina that he would resupply the fort peacefully, unless resisted. So the Confederate government, interpreting this as an act of aggression, ordered General PGT Beauregard to demand surrender. When Major Robert Anderson, the Union commander at Fort Sumter, refused Confederate forces, so when the Union commander at Fort Sumter refused, the Confederate forces opened fire on April 12, 1861, bombarding the fort for 34 hours until Anderson surrendered on April 13th. So there were no casualties during the battle itself, but the die was cast. So the Civil War had begun. So Lincoln, he responded swiftly and decisively, because on April 15th, he issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. And this executive action, though constitutional, it was a de facto declaration of war, because it galvanized the North, but also had the unintended consequence of pushing four more states, with Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, to secede, joining the Confederacy. So the Confederate capital was soon moved from Montgomery, Alabama, to Richmond, Virginia, placing it only about 100 miles away from Washington, D.C. So the war would now be fought on an industrial and ideological scale no American had yet imagined. So Lincoln's most difficult time and persistent challenge as commander in chief was finding effective military leadership, because he initially appointed General George B. McClellan to lead the army of the Potomac. So, though McClellan was admired by his troops, his excessive caution and unwillingness to engage the enemy frustrated Lincoln. So, despite having superior numbers and intelligence, he repeatedly failed to pursue the Confederate army aggressively, particularly after the Battle of the Battle of Antietam, of Antietam, Antietam. My apologies. On September 1862. So Lincoln, he cycled through a series of generals known to be Ambrose Burnside, Joseph Hooker, and others, each failing to deliver a decisive victory of demonstrating weaknesses in strategy or execution. And finally, in 1864, he promoted Ulysses S. Grant to the position of General in Chief of the Union armies. So Grant, he brought a clear eye aggressive approach. So a clear aggressive approach, coordinating effectively with generals like William Tecumseh Sherman. So yeah, William Tecumseh Sherman, and embracing total war as a necessity to break the Confederacy's will and their resources. And also, one of Lincoln's most defining decisions, it came after the Battle of Antietam. Though technically inconclusive, Antietam was a strategic turning point and the bloodiest single day in American history, with over 22,000 casualties on both sides. Lincoln seized the moment to issue a warning that if the Confederate States did not rejoin the Union by January 1st, 1863, he would free their slaves. And when no states returned, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, declaring that all slaves in Confederate held territory shall be thenceforward, and forever free. While it did not apply to border states or rebel areas already under Union control, the proclamation was revolutionary. So what this did was that it transformed the Civil War into a moral crusade against slavery, in addition to a battle to preserve the Union. And it prevented the European powers, particularly Britain and France, from recognizing or supporting the Confederacy, as their populations largely opposed slavery. And it also paved the way for the enlistment of over 180,000 black soldiers and sailors in the Union Army and the Navy, many of whom were formerly enslaved. And also at this time, you also had the suspension of the habeas corpus. So to maintain internal order and prevent Confederate sympathizers from sabotaging the Union war effort, Lincoln took unprecedented constitutional measures. Most controversially, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, particularly in Maryland and other border states. So what this did was this allowed military authorities to detain thousands without trial. And Lincoln, he even justified the move as necessary to preserve the nation, because in a message to Congress in 1863, he posed a rhetorical question that are all the laws but one to go unexecuted and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated. So the decision, it sparked a lot of fierce debate over civil liberties and executive power, a debate that continues in times of national emergency. And you also have the different key events of the Civil War. So the first one to talk about is the First Battle of Bull Run and Manassas. So the first major battle occurred in July 1861 in Virginia. So eager to end the rebellion quickly, Union troops, they marched toward Richmond, but they were repelled by a smaller Confederate force under Generals Beauregard and Stonewall Jackson. So the Union defeats, it shattered illusions of a short war, and also revealed the deep resolve of the Confederacy. And in 1862, you had the Battle of Antietam. So on September 17th, 1862, the Union and the Confederate forces, they clashed near Sharpsburg, Maryland, and the result here was the bloodiest single day in U.S. history. Though technically it was a draw, it halted Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North, and it gave Lincoln the victory that he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And then 1863, you have Gettysburg and Vicksburg. So Gettysburg, from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863. So this was Robert E. Lee's second invasion of the North, and this ended in catastrophic defeat. So the Union Army under General George Meade held high ground and repelled Confederate assaults, including the ill-fated Pickett's Charge. With over 50,000 casualties, Gettysburg marked the turning point of the war in the East. And then you have Vicksburg from May to July 1863. Now, simultaneously, General Grant, he led a brilliant campaign to seize Vicksburg, Mississippi, a Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. And its fall on July 4th, 1863, it gave the Union control of the river, and it cut the Confederacy in two, severing Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest. And then you have 1864, Sherman's March to the Sea. So with Grant locking Lee's army in trench warfare near Richmond and Petersburg, General Sherman, he embarked on his legendary campaign through Georgia. Now, after capturing Atlanta in September 1864, Sherman, he conducted a scorched earth march to Savannah, destroying railroads, burning crops, and dismantling the Confederate economy and infrastructure. So the campaign, it was devastating, but it was effective because it demoralized the southern population and it disrupted the supply lines and it weakened the Confederate resistance. So Sherman's tactics represented a shift to total power, to the total war, targeting not just the enemy armies but the resources that sustained them. And then we have 1865, the fall of Richmond and Appomattox. So by early 1865, Confederate forces were already exhausted and outmatched. So on April 2nd, you had the Union troops. They broke through the lines at Petersburg, forcing Lee to abandon Richmond, and the Confederate capital fell the next day. Lincoln visited the ruined city shortly thereafter, welcomed by emancipated African Americans. And on April 9th, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant, effectively ending the war. And Grant's terms were generous. Basically, the Confederate soldiers, they were allowed to return home with their horses and their personal weapons. And what this did was that it helped to begin the process, the healing process, though much blood had already been spilled by this point. And we also have another part with the speeches and the philosophical legacy. So, first thing is talk about is the Gettysburg Address, November 19th, 1863. So, the context behind this is so the Gettysburg Address. So, this was delivered during the dedication of the Soldiers National Cemetery at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, just 4.5 months after the pivotal battle of Gettysburg. And Lincoln, his brief speech, it came at a critical moment. It came at a critical moment in the Civil War because the Union had achieved a significant military victory, but the war's outcome was still uncertain, and its meaning remained deeply contested. So Lincoln's address served not only to honor the dead, but to give moral clarity and national purpose to the war effort. So the structure and literary technique behind this was so though it was only 271 words long, this address is one of the most tightly constructed and rhetorically profound speeches in American history because it unfolds in three temporal movements. So on one hand, you have the past, and in the past it says this: 4 score and 7 years ago. This biblical phrasing evokes solemnity and timelessness, deliberately recalling 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence, not 1787 when the Constitution was signed. In doing so, Lincoln rooted the nation's founding ideals in equality, not merely legal structure. And then you have the present. So now that we are engaged in a great civil war, Lincoln acknowledges the immense national crisis not just as a struggle for the Union, but as a test of the survival of a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And in the future, it is rather for us to be here dedicated. So Lincoln, he shifts from eulogy to exhortation, calling the living to continue the unfinished work and ensure that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So Lincoln, he radically reframed the Civil War as more than a political or military conflict. In earlier years, he had maintained that the Union's primary goal was preservation. But by 1863, after the proclamation, he now cast the war as the means through which the nation would undergo a new birth of freedom. So this phrase is deeply symbolic because really what it does is it connects the war sacrifice to a redemptive national transformation. And it implies that the original birth of the nation in 1776 was incomplete. And it also suggests that freedom must be renewed, that equality must be actualized, and that the struggle for liberty is ongoing. So the phrase a new birth of freedom, it reframed the Union cause from a defensive effort to preserve an old Union in a into a proactive moral crusade to redefine the nation as a space of freedom and equality for all. And this philosophical legacy. So His Gettysburg Address became a moral compass for the United States because it democratized the national ethos by elevating the Declaration of Independence over the Constitution, placing moral principles above mere legal structure. And it also served as a touchstone for civil rights movements, like Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. For instance, it echoed Lincoln's call for actualizing the promise of equality, and it codified the idea that national purpose is tied to universal ideals, making the United States not merely a geographical so pretty much not making the United States not merely a geographical entity, but an experiment in moral governance. And we also have the second inaugural address. So the context behind this one was by March 1865, the Civil War was nearing its end. The Confederacy was on the brink of collapse, and Lincoln he had already been reelected at this time. Now, while most inaugural addresses would celebrate victory or outline policy, Lincoln took a different approach because he reflected on the moral and the spiritual dimensions of the conflict, delivering a more sermon-like meditation on national guilt, divine judgment, and reconciliation. So, in a marked shift from the earlier ambiguity of political discourse, Lincoln explicitly identifies slavery as the cause of the Civil War, saying that all knew that this interest, known as slavery, it was somehow the cause of the war. And this is historically significant because he acknowledges that the entire nation, not just the South, it was complicit in the institution of slavery. And the phrase, this interest, it uses this sort of like, metonymy, which is like a rhetorical device, one that softens the term but also universalizes responsibility. So really, he doesn't demonize, but he reflects on this. He reflects. And Lincoln, he also so really in one of the most sobering sections of the speech, he ponders that the war it might be God's punishment for the national sin of slavery. So he said in this, yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, still it must be said the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So here, Lincoln, he invokes Psalm 19, verse 19. And this shows a humble submission to divine will, even amid national agony, a moral balancing the bloodshed of war as atonement for centuries of injustice, and a deep theological framing of the Civil War, not merely as a political reckoning, but a spiritual purification of the nation. So this stands as one of the most haunting acknowledgments of collective moral responsibility ever voiced by a national leader. And also a call for healing. So the most famous and widely quoted line from the address is with malice toward none, with charity for all. So it's not merely poetic, it's philosophical doctrine. So Lincoln, he envisions a civic ethic of forgiveness, not vengeance. And this is crucial because he understood that peace without mercy would be shallow and temporary. And his aim was reconciliation, not retribution, especially in a moment when the defeated Confederacy could have been subject to harsh punishment. So his invitation is inclusive, almost pastoral, because he addresses both the North and the South, the victors and the vanquished, not as enemies, but as co sufferers in a shared national tragedy. So the second inaugural address is arguably Lincoln's greatest speech, surpassing even the Gettysburg Address in philosophical depth, because its legacy it includes an enduring model of statesmanship, rooted in humility and empathy, a rare example of moral reflection in political leadership. And Lincoln, he did not claim righteousness but confessed complicity. So a template for national reconciliation, saying that it would later inspire. So this would later inspire post-apartheid South Africa and U.S. civil rights leaders and truth and reconciliation efforts around the world. So now we're going to talk about the assassination and the death of Abraham Lincoln. So by April 1865, the U.S. was at a crossroads. So the Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in American history, it was drawing to a close. Because on April 9th, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, he surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, effectively ending the major Confederate resistance. But just 5 days later, on April 14th, 1865, the Americans were beginning to celebrate a hard-won peace. So President Lincoln, weary but hopeful, attended a play with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, at Ford's Theater in Washington D.C. So what unfolded that night would not only shock the nation, but reverberate throughout American history forever. So the Ford's Theater, located on 10th Street, NW in Washington D.C., was a popular venue for theatrical performances. So on the evening of April 14th, the featured play was Our American Cousin, which is a British farce comedy by Tom Taylor. So Lincoln, he was an avid theater goer and a Shakespeare enthusiast. So he invited General Grant and his wife to join him and the First Lady. However, the Grants declined the invitation and instead they left Washington for New Jersey. And this led the Lincolns to attend with Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancee, Clara Harris. So Lincoln, he arrived at the theater shortly after 8 p.m. and he was seated in the presidential box above the stage, draped with American flags and adorned with the image of George Washington. So the audience, they cheered upon seeing him, and so he was deeply beloved by many people in the North. So the assassin was known as John Wilkes Booth. So John Wilkes Booth, so he was a 26-year-old actor and Southern sympathizer. So he hailed from a prominent theatrical family. So his father, Junius Brutus Booth, and his brother Edwin Booth, so they were both acclaimed actors. Now, unlike his brother, however, Booth, he was a vehement supporter of slavery and the Confederacy because he viewed Lincoln as a tyrant who had destroyed the South and overstepped presidential powers. In his eyes, Lincoln's reelection in 1864 and recent efforts to enfranchise African American men were an abomination. So Booth, he had initially plotted to kidnap Lincoln and hold him for ransom in exchange for the release of Confederate prisoners. And when that failed, and with the Confederacy in ruins, he hatched a more violent plan, which of course was assassination. So Booth, he believed that by killing Lincoln and the top members of the administration, he could inspire the South to rise again. It was a desperate, delusional hope. So Booth, so there's a conspiracy in this that Booth, he wasn't acting alone in this because he orchestrated a conspiracy involving at least 9 other people. So on the night of April 14th, the plan called for Lewis Powell, also an alias known as Lewis Payne, to assassinate Secretary of State William H. Seward at his home. And then you had George Atzerodt to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. So Booth himself, he would kill Lincoln. And the hope in all this was to decapacitate the Union leadership in a single coordinated strike. In reality, only Booth had succeeded. So, at approximately 10:15 p.m., during Act 3, Scene 2 of Our American Cousin, laughter erupted in the theater as the character Asa Trenchard delivered one of the play's most humorous lines. So Booth he used the moment of levity to mask his approach. He had gained easy access to the president's box as an actor and a familiar face, so he encountered little resistance. So he entered the box through a hallway behind the stage, where he had previously prepared by carving a small hole in the door to spy on Lincoln and wedging a stick to block anyone from opening it. And once he was inside, he stepped behind Lincoln, who was seated in a rocking chair. And without a word, he pulled out a .44 caliber Derringer pistol, and he fired a single shot at point blank range into the back of Lincoln's head, just behind the left ear. So the bullet it entered Lincoln's skull, traveled through the brain, and it lodged behind his right eye. Lincoln he slumped forward, and his wife Mary had screamed. So Major Rathbone he lunged. So he lunged at Booth, who slashed him with a dagger, severing his brachial artery. So Booth he then vaulted over the front of the box and he dropped about 12 feet to the stage below. In the fall, he broke the fibula in his left leg, possibly when a spur caught a decorative flag. So rising in pain, he allegedly turned to the audience and he shouted, Sic semper tyrannis, which is Latin for thus always to tyrants, which is Virginia's state motto. Some accounts claim he added, the South is avenged. So he limped out the back of the theater, mounted a waiting horse, and he fled into the night. So Lincoln's final hours. So doctors in the audience, including Dr. Charles Leo, he had rushed to the president's side, and they found him unconscious and barely breathing, knowing he could not survive a trip back to the White House. So Lincoln he was carried across the street to the Peterson boarding house, and there in a back bedroom, doctors tried to relieve pressure on his brain, but the wound it was mortal. And Mary Lincoln wept by his side, overcome with grief. The cabinet members gathered silently. So Secretary of War Edwin Stanton took control of the situation, declaring the deathbed scene a matter of national security. So at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was pronounced dead. Stanton solemnly declared, now he belongs to the ages. He was 56 years old, and the room fell silent. So the immediate reaction. So the news of Lincoln's assassination. So the news of his assassination it spread rapidly by telegraph because throughout the North, cities tolled church bells. They had draped buildings in the black crepe and held candlelight vigils. Newspapers printed special editions with mourning borders. And Lincoln, he had become a martyr, a symbol of unity and sacrifice. So Lincoln, his body lay in state at the White House and the U.S. Capitol. Over 100,000 mourners viewed his casket in Washington. And then came the funeral train. Now, the funeral train, this was known as the Lincoln Special. So the train departed Washington on April 21st, 1865, retracing the route that Lincoln had taken to Washington in 1861. And it passed through 7 states and 180 cities and towns, stopping for ceremonies and public mourning in Baltimore, in Harrisburg, Philadelphia, New York, Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, and Chicago. So the journey covered about 1,654 miles over 13 days, finally reaching Springfield, Illinois, where Lincoln was buried at Oak Ridge Cemetery on May 4th, 1865. So after this, there was a manhunt for the people that were that were in this, that were all involved in this plot, killing Lincoln and others that were included. So Booth he fled south through Maryland and into Virginia, aided by sympathizers. After 12 days on the run, he was cornered on April 26, 1865, in a tobacco barn on the Garrett Farm near Port Royal, Virginia. So refusing to surrender, Booth was shot by a Union soldier known by as Boston Corbett, and the bullet it pierced Booth's neck, severing his spinal cord, and he died within hours. So he died within hours, and his last words were reportedly useless, useless. And his co-conspirators they were quickly captured. So there were four, including Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, David Harold, and Mary Surratt. So Mary Surratt, by the way, she's the first woman that's executed by the federal government. So the first woman ever to be executed by the federal government. So all of them they were hanged on July 7th, 1865, and others who were involved they received prison sentences. So Lincoln's assassination was a trauma from which the nation has struggled to recover. His death deprived the country of a leader uniquely capable of navigating the post-war Reconstruction, and it opened the door for Andrew Johnson, so whose lenient policies and his clashes with Congress failed to secure the rights of newly freed African Americans. So Lincoln he became an icon in death, the great emancipator as they called him, enshrined in monuments, currency, and memory. So his assassination it marked the first killing of a sitting American president and forever altered the office's security protocols. And now we'll talk about the legacy and the impact that Abraham Lincoln had in terms of the legacy impact that Abraham Lincoln had. So the first to talk about is the abolition of slavery. So the 13th Amendment, 1865. So Abraham Lincoln's most profound and enduring legacy is his pivotal role in ending slavery in the United States. Now, while the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 is often cited as a watershed moment, but it was really the 13th Amendment that was passed by Congress on January 31st, 1865, and ratified by the states on December 6th, 1865, that legally abolished slavery in the entire nation. So, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, so shall exist within the United States or any place subject to jurisdiction. So this was the text of the 13th Amendment here. So that's the text of the amendment. So though he did not live to see the final ratification of this, his political maneuvering and his moral commitment to ending slavery, they were crucial in its passage. So he pressured Congress, particularly House Democrats, to support the amendment, offering positions, and political support in exchange for votes. And this was vividly dramatized in the film Lincoln, which came out in 2012, and based also on Doris Kearns Goodwin's book Team of Rivals, and it reflected the real historical events. So Lincoln's shift from a moderate anti-slavery position, opposing the expansion of slavery rather than its existence, to an aggressive push for total abolition, marked one of the most important ideological transformations in American political history. So his decision to tie emancipation directly to the Union war policy not only redefined the Civil War's moral purpose, but it also permanently altered the Constitution and the soul of the nation. And the second also is the preservation of the Union. So Lincoln's second towering legacy is the preservation of the Union. So during the most severe constitutional crisis in American history, known as the Civil War, so when he assumed the presidency in March in 1861, seven southern states had already seceded, and four more would soon follow after the attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861. So the federal union was fracturing. And the reason why his leadership mattered is because he rejected any legitimacy of secession, calling it both unconstitutional and morally wrong. So his first inaugural address, it made clear that he viewed the Union as perpetual and indissoluble. So the Union, so basically he said, in this case that the Union is older. So the Union is older than the Constitution, and it was formed, in fact, by the Articles of Association in 1774. So perpetuity is implied. And Lincoln, he also interpreted his oath of office as a mandate to preserve the Union at all costs, leading him to take unprecedented executive actions, including suspending the habeas corpus to suppress rebellion and dissent, instituting a naval blockade of southern ports, and calling for troops without congressional approval. So these actions they help shape the modern presidency, expanding executive power during wartime and national crisis. So by refusing to compromise on the Union's survival, even at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, Lincoln he ensured the continuity of the United States as a single sovereign nation. Without his resolve, the U.S. might have splintered into multiple smaller nations with competing interests and ideologies. And also, another one was racial justice. So Lincoln's relationship with racial justice, now it's complex and evolving and deeply human. So in the 1850s, he often spoke of slavery as morally wrong, but did not initially advocate for political or social equality for African Americans. So his early debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858 it showed a cautious tone. So Lincoln he even stated that he was not in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and the black races. However, the war, the pressure of enslaved people fleeing the Union lines, and demands of radical Republicans, it forced Lincoln to rethink his positions. So his friendship with abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and his own evolving sense of justice and human dignity, it led to a significant transformation. So the key examples of his growth on racial justice, well, obviously the Emancipation Proclamation, and also you had his second inaugural address in 1865, where he acknowledged that the war may be God's punishment for the sin of slavery. So his willingness to admit national guilt and moral failure, it was unprecedented among American presidents. So though he did not live to lead Reconstruction, his commitment to racial justice, it laid the moral groundwork for future civil rights struggles. And his redefinition of freedom, it helped pave the way for the 14th and the 15th Amendments, which included citizenship and voting rights, the civil rights movement of the 20th century, and the symbolic invocation of Lincoln by leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who famously delivered the I Have a Dream speech from the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. And you also have the political philosophy. So Lincoln's political ideology was rooted in a profound reverence for the U.S. Constitution, a belief in natural rights, and a deep moral conviction that democracy required both equality under the law and moral leadership. So the core tenets of his political thought were that you had democracy and rule of law. So in this, Lincoln often quoted the Declaration of Independence more than the Constitution, especially the phrase that all men are created equal, because he believed in popular sovereignty, but not if it meant the subversion of moral justice. And he also warned that democracy would fail if might made right. If any group could override national policy or national principles for selfish interests, such as slave-holding states. And the second is the moral purpose of government. So Lincoln he held that government should do for the people what they cannot do for themselves, such as ensuring liberty and justice. Because in his words, the legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. And the third is pragmatic idealist. So, though a man of principle, Lincoln was also politically astute because he knew when to compromise and when to hold firm. So this balance allowed him to keep that fragile union together while also pushing the moral arc forward. And then last but not least, the presidency as an instrument of moral authority. Because Lincoln, he transformed the role of the president from a primarily administrative post into a moral for the nation, a moral compass for the nation. So his eloquent oratory and clarity of vision elevated the presidency during crisis. And you also have the memorials and the cultural impact. So Lincoln's legacy permeates American history, the memory more than perhaps any other figure in U.S. history, because his cultural canonization began immediately after his death, with mourners lining the train route of his funeral procession across the country. So he became a symbol of national unity, sacrifice, and moral clarity. So, so the notable memorials and the symbols. Of course, you have the Lincoln's Memorial in 1922. So this is located on the National Mall in Washington D.C. and it's modeled after a Greek temple. So this imposing statue of a seated Lincoln overlooks the reflecting pool, and on its walls are engraved the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural Address, reminding visitors of his vision of a new birth of freedom, and also Mount Rushmore from 1927 to 1941. So Lincoln is one of the four presidents that is actually carved into this monument, chosen for his role in preserving the nation and abolishing slavery. And his inclusion alongside George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Theodore Roosevelt highlights his foundational role in American democracy. And also the countless namesakes. So, Lincoln, Nebraska, the only state capital named after a U.S. president. And you also have hundreds of schools, parks, streets, and public buildings named after him. And his image is also found on the penny and also on the $5 bill. And even statues of him stand in virtually every state. And the pop culture and the political reference. So Lincoln has been he's been revered, has been revered by presidents across the political spectrum, from FDR to Reagan, from Obama to Biden. So he represents a unifying moral standard, and his speeches, especially the Gettysburg Address, they're all taught in schools and they're also quoted in political rhetoric to this very day. And also personality and character. So really, he was known. So Lincoln, he was known for his deep empathy. He was known for his sharp wit and storytelling, depression and melancholy, a strong moral compass, and he was also tall and he was physically imposing. Because he stood at 6'4", often wore a stovepipe hat as well. And just to recap, we also want to recap the timeline of a lot of the key events here overall that took place in this time. So the key timeline events. So in 1809, Abraham Lincoln. So he was born in Kentucky. 1834, he was elected to the Illinois House. 1846, elected to the U.S. House. 1858, you had the Lincoln Douglas debates. 1860, elected president. 1861, Civil War begins. 1863, Emancipation Proclamation, and then 1865, the war ends, but unfortunately he is assassinated. So his legacy as the great emancipator and the preserver of the Union, now it places him among the most consequential leaders in human history, because his ability to navigate a fractured nation through civil war to end slavery and articulate the ideals of democracy, it continues to influence political and ethical thought to this day. So once again, he still remains a global symbol of leadership through integrity, vision, and courage. So even though he is often revered as one of the greatest American presidents, for preserving the Union during the Civil War and issuing the proclamation, however, though, like all powerful leaders, his legacy is not without flaws. So there are a lot of things that were controversial and also were criticized and were morally questionable aspects when it came to Lincoln's time being, his time being president. His time when it came to politics at this point. So the first, the first to talk about is once again his suspension of the habeas corpus. So once again, what happened? So in April 1861, amidst the outbreak of the Civil War, he suspended the writ of the habeas corpus along the critical rail line between Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, citing the need to protect the capital and the Union troop movements. And this constitutional right, it allows individuals to challenge unlawful detention. And over time, the suspension expanded across the nation and it remained in effect until the war's conclusion. Now, the reason why this is so controversial is because the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, it allows the suspension of habeas corpus when in cases of rebellion or invasion. The public safety may require it, but it is listed under congressional powers. So Lincoln's unilateral decision to suspend this writ without congressional authorization, it sparked a lot of fierce criticism because Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, Roger B. Taney, ruled in ex parte Merryman 1861, and saying that Lincoln's actions were unconstitutional. But Lincoln, he ignored the decision. So the reason on why, so the impact that this had was that thousands of people were detained because more than 13,000 civilians, including the newspaper editors, the anti-war protesters, the judges, and even elected officials, they were arrested without formal charges. And you also had the suppression of dissent because the arrest of the Maryland legislators, it prevented the state from seceding, but it also stifled democratic process. And you also had the precedent set because Lincoln's expansion of executive wartime authority has influenced later presidencies, especially during World War II and the War on Terror, raising concerns over civil liberties in times of national crisis and moral ambiguity. Because while the Union, while it was preserved, the constitutional foundation it claimed to protect was severely strained in the process. And the second is the mass execution of Dakota warriors in 1862. So, what happened exactly? So, following the Dakota War of 1862 in Minnesota, an uprising fueled by broken treaties, starvation, and governmental neglect, 303 Dakota men were condemned to death by military tribunals. The trials were often brief, some lasting mere minutes, and it lacked the basic legal standards. So Lincoln, he reviewed the verdicts and he reduced the number of executions to 38. So on December 26, 1862, the condemned were hanged in Moncato, in, Mon- in Moncato, Minnesota, the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Now, the reason on why this is criticized is because it's because of its due process violations. Because many trials fail to distinguish between those who fought as warriors and those accused of specific war crimes. And you also have political expedient 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 expediency. My apologies once again. But yes, but Lincoln's his decision to reduce the number of executions, it was a compromise between justice and political survival because he sought to placate white Minnesotans demanding punishment while minimizing backlash from those critical of excessive punishment. And then you have the moral cost because the execution it contributed to a long-term trauma among Dakota people, and it's widely regarded as an act of racial injustice. So the impact of this is that it caused a lot of native dispossession because the U.S. government they used the uprising as justification to expel the Dakota from Minnesota, confiscate their lands, and to cancel annuities. And also, it created a legacy of distrust because the event it deepened Native American mistrust of the federal government, and it highlighted Lincoln's indifference to indigenous sovereignty and justice. And third, you also have Lincoln's racist statements and beliefs. So what happened is that so in 1858, Lincoln and Douglas debates And other public speeches, Lincoln frequently voiced, so he frequently voiced white supremacist beliefs because he opposed slavery on moral grounds, but did not advocate for full equality. So examples of this can be obviously in 1858, the debate in Charleston, Illinois. So Lincoln he declared that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. And also, it was the support for colonization. So he consistently supported the resettlement of free black people to Africa or Central America, claiming that whites and blacks could not coexist peacefully in the U.S. Now, the reason why this is so criticized is because once again, it's the moral inconsistency. Because Lincoln's opposition to slavery it coexisted with deep-seated racial prejudice and a pragmatic rather than a moral approach to abolition, and also the legacy being whitewashed. So the mythologizing of Lincoln it often obscures the fact that he viewed black people as inferior for most of his life, and also the impacts. So the qualified emancipator. So his statements they provide fuel for the argument that Lincoln's fight against slavery was more about preserving the Union than achieving racial justice. And also, it was the continued colonization policies because his support for colonization directly undermined efforts by black leaders and abolitionists who fought for integration and equal citizenship. And you also have the Emancipation Proclamation, the limitations and the motives of this. So, what happened is the proclamation, effective on January 1st, 1863, it declared freedom for enslaved people in Confederate controlled territories, but not in border states or areas already under Union control. Now, the reason on why this is criticized is because slaves in loyal states like Kentucky or Maryland, they were not freed. And Lincoln, he had the authority to end slavery. He had the authority to end slavery there, but he chose not to. Chose not to risk alienating the pro-union slaveholders. And also, the proclamation it was much as a military tactic as it was a moral statement intended to weaken the Confederacy and prevent the British and the French intervention and encourage slave rebellion. So the impact of this is that it really didn't end slavery specifically. So like it really didn't end slavery because the actual abolition it actually came with the 13th Amendment in 1865 and the military recruitment because over 180,000 black men they joined the Union Army after the proclamation, but they still face segregation, lower pay, and they still face a lot of abuse. And the historical myth, and the myth is the proclamation. It's often taught as the end of slavery, but ignoring its strategic and its limited nature. And you also have the censorship and the suppression of the press. So what happened was throughout the Civil War, Lincoln's administration they arrested critics, they censored telegraphs, and they shut down opposition newspapers. And journalists who questioned the war efforts or Lincoln's policies, they faced surveillance, imprisonment, or intimidation. So it's criticized because the administration's actions represent one of the most aggressive assaults on press freedom in the United States history. And the military tribunals, because in areas not under rebellion, civilians they were tried in military courts, violating the constitutional protections, which was a practice that was later condemned in the Ex parte Milligan in 1866. So the impact of this was the Civil War. The Civil War became a controlled narrative because those who questioned it, they were often silenced. And Lincoln's actions they laid the groundwork for future wartime censorship during World War One, World War Two, and the McCarthy era. And also, you have the Enrollment Acts and the draft riots in 1863. So what happened was the Enrollment Act of 1863 was the first federal draft in U.S. history because it allowed men to avoid service by hiring a substitute or paying $300 or paying a $300 commutation fee, about a year's salary for a working class laborer. So the reason why this is criticized is because the draft became known as a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. So in New York City, there was also like a lot of racial tensions. Largely the white Irish immigrants, they rioted in opposition to the draft and to fears that free black people would take their jobs. And then the response by the government. Because Lincoln, he sent Union troops from Gettysburg to suppress the riots, resulting over 100 deaths, and many of them were black residents. So the impact of this was that the draft, it deepened resentment between the working class whites and the black Americans. And then the federal military, so when it came to martial law in New York City, the federal military intervention on home soil became a defining and divisive moment in Civil War domestic policy. And then you had the colonization and the black resettlement. So what happened here was Lincoln supported colonization throughout his career. And even as late as 1862, he met with black leaders and suggested voluntary immigration to Central America. Now, the reason on why this is criticized is because colonization implied that black people had no future in America, denying them the right to citizenship in the country that they built and were born in. And then black leaders like Frederick Douglass, he denounced colonization as an insult to their American identity. And the impact of all this was that Lincoln's support for colonization underscored his discomfort with true integration and equality. And colonization, the efforts of the colonization, they failed logistically and morally, and they were eventually abandoned, but not before sending hundreds into harsh foreign environments. And then you also have the expansion of executive power. So what happened here was that Lincoln, he expanded the presidency in unprecedented ways. So he declared naval blockades without congressional approval, and once again he suspended the habeas corpus unilaterally. He raised troops and he spent funds without authorization, and he interfered in state politics. And the reason why this is criticized so much is because Lincoln set the standard for wartime presidents to override the constitutional checks and the balances, and these actions also eroded the legislative branch's war powers. So the impact of all this was that you had, the future presidents such as FDR, Richard Nixon, and George W. Bush all invoked. So they invoked Lincoln to justify their controversial policies. And then you also had historians, because historians, even they debate whether Lincoln preserved the Constitution or he nearly destroyed it in the name of saving the Union. And also the treatment of the border states and political repression. So what happened here was in the Union states like Maryland and Missouri, Lincoln's administration arrested political opponents and they also suspended civil rights and declared martial law. And the reason why this is criticized is because these were not rebellious states, because Lincoln's tactics were seen as preemptive strikes against potential disloyalty. And you also had the Union soldiers, because Union soldiers often patrolled the polling places to ensure that the pro-union candidates were elected. So basically voter intimidation. And the impact of all this was that it had a chilling effect because political repression in loyal states, it sowed distrust in Lincoln's commitment to democracy. And these tactics also previewed the future government surveillance of dissenters. So, what are some lessons that we ourselves can learn from Abraham Lincoln when it comes to his life and his presidency? Well, there's a lot that we can learn overall in terms of so there's a lot that we all can learn from Lincoln's life and his presidency in this case. So, The first to learn from is the leadership and morality in crisis. So the lessons are that moral leadership, it often requires navigating the complex political and the social landscapes with imperfect tools and outcomes. And also that presidential power, it can expand dramatically during wartime, but it must be constantly evaluated against the constitutional limits. And the second is the evolving beliefs and the pragmatic politics. So, the personal beliefs, they may evolve over time, and political pragmatism, it can play a significant role in driving historical outcomes. And another lesson is even leaders we admire, they can hold views that reflect the prejudice that reflect the prejudices of their time. And the third lesson is the power and the pitfalls of executive action. So, what we learn here is the bold use of executive power can preserve the nation or undermine democratic norms, and also that justice and expedience, they often clash during national emergencies with long-term consequences. And we also have the limits of symbolic acts. So the lesson here is the Emancipation Proclamation, while powerful, it has strategic limitations that reveal the gap between idealism and real politics. And you also have the complexities of race, equality, and memory. And here, is to show you that historical figures like Lincoln, they must be examined not only for their accomplishments, but also for how but also how they contributed to or how they failed to challenge, systemic racism. And finally, legacy versus reality. So national myths, they can obscure the uncountable truths, and it's our responsibility to reckon with both of them. And ladies and gentlemen, that overall does it here for our video here today. So to pretty much sum it up overall, Lincoln's legacy as the great emancipator and the preserver of the Union, it places him among the most consequential leaders in human history. Because his ability to navigate a fractured nation through civil war and slavery and articulate the ideals of democracy, it continues to influence political and ethical thought to this day. So he remains a towering figure in American history. In American history, but his legacy is deeply complex because once again, while he did, of course, still preserve the Union and he set the groundwork for emancipation, he also violated constitutional protections. He authorized mass execution without fair trials. He suppressed the press. He upheld white supremacist views, advocated colonization over integration, and he expanded executive authority to dangerous levels. So Lincoln's legacy, it shouldn't necessarily be, reduced to him being somebody to hero worship or to basically like condemn purely, because he was a wartime president who made a lot of difficult decisions in a time of national crisis. But many of those decisions included all these things. So a lot of these issues, everything with mass executions, the suppression of civil liberties, and the racist statements, the support for colonization, and the constitutional overreach, they all deserve critical examination. So once again, even though he did play a pivotal role in ending slavery and preserving the Union, he also committed acts that today in society they would be considered to be authoritarian, racially prejudiced, or morally dubious. But other than that, though, Lincoln still remains a global symbol of leadership through integrity, vision, and courage. And with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, that does it here today. And always remember that no matter the challenge, always be smooth, always be steady, and always be aggressive. Stay focused, stay determined, and keep pushing forward. And until next time, keep rising to the occasion. Peace.